old-fashioned ways, he would have gone off to a quiet retirement, not a gulag like the old days, but instead we see Mr. Gorbachev all over our television set. My gosh, he was on Larry King Live the night before last. He's running a peace institute. He's running an environmental institute. And in one of the final little ironies in this changeover, I have discovered that Mr. Gorbachev has opened up one of his institutes at the Presidio of San Francisco, which is where we used to have a United States Army base. So I now have a former Russian leader running an environmental institute at a United States Army base. Is this a great country or what? What has happened, ladies and gentlemen, and what's going to be happening in the future is that history is taking two paths. One path is the path of the future and democracy and market economy and reform, what Mr. Yeltsin is trying to do. The other path, regrettably, goes in the opposite direction, with some nations returning to 1914 to fight out old wars, to fight out old grudges, to take up ethnic conflicts that were never dealt with during the period of superpower confrontation. And so while we live in a time of hope, a time of great promise, we also live in a time of uncertainty, a time of danger. We are going to see a lot more Bosnias and Somalias and Haitis, Georgias and Azerbaijani problems and Tajikistani problems. And it will not always be clear what the role of the United States should be in each and every one of these crises. President Clinton and his team have a more difficult problem to deal with than President Bush or President Reagan or President Carter and all of the other previous presidents who had the policy of containment and a clearly identifiable Soviet Union to deal with. We won't have that in the future. And it will take time for the president and his team to figure out exactly what policy does replace the old policy of containment. But there's one thing I'm absolutely sure of, and that is that history and destiny have given the United States of America the responsibility to lead this new world that would be free. We can't come back to Fortress America. We cannot leave the world stage. In all my travels over the last 6 years, every part of the world I've gone to, Eastern Europe, Asia, South America, those military and political leaders all come up to me and say, don't return back to Fortress America. We trust you. You are the only power on earth that we are willing to place such trust in. We know that you seek dominion over no one. You seek sovereignty over no one. The only land you ever claimed after fighting 2 world wars in Europe was the land that you needed to bury your dead. You stand for values. You stand for principle. For God's sakes, America, please lead us into this new world. And that's what we must do in this administration and in subsequent administrations. The stakes are too high for us to consider any other possibility. It will be a world not of World War III, but of smaller wars. And if we needed any reminder of that, Saddam Hussein gave it to us 2 years ago. I could not believe that as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when I was talking to the Congress about bringing down the size of our armed forces because we weren't going to have to fight the Soviet Union, I was also briefing the Congress on sending 540,000 troops 8,000 miles away under a man known as Norm the Bear Schwarzkopf to deal with this challenge from a tyrant by the name of Saddam Hussein. And we dealt with that challenge. You saw 541 great young Americans go off and solve that problem and restore Kuwait to its proper rulers, to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait, to bring some stability to the region, and also, I might add, to bring down to size the principal threat to the security of Israel. I'll never forget those difficult days of Desert Storm, and the one element of our success that I will never forget is the restraint that was shown by the State of Israel during that critical period when the Scuds were flying. And I know my Israeli colleagues, I know the generals in the IDF, and I know that the generals in the IDF were dying to strike back because that's what they are so good at. I knew what was motivating them, what they felt they had to do. Many of them came to see me and we talked about this military problem. And the point I made to them is, this is the time for patience. We know what the IDF can do, but let this job be done by American boys and Egyptian boys and Syrian boys and British boys. And if you let us do this and show patience, it'll open up an entire new chapter in Middle East history. And in an act of incredible political courage, Prime Minister Shamir at that time did show the restraint necessary to allow us to finish that job. And I hope everybody here agrees with me that that was an act of supreme statesmanship on the part of the Israeli leadership at that time. We won that war and we brought the boys back home and the girls back home. Something happened during that period to America, though, that I had not anticipated, I had not expected, I would not have believed. And that was the country went a little nuts. The country went a little nuts over this success in Desert Storm. There was a huge outpouring of affection. Do you remember the parade here? A huge outpouring of affection as the relief swept over us that the war wasn't as bad as it might have been and our casualties were low. And the American armed forces had performed brilliantly. Wait a minute, everybody said. Aren't these young kids who aren't supposed to be able to do anything? Aren't these young kids you've been telling us for years are not well educated, not committed, don't have self-discipline? What's this I'm seeing on my television screen? I'm seeing proud young Americans of all colors, all races, all backgrounds, all religions from every part of the country, working together as a team, working together as a family. They're drug-free, they're proud, they're trained, they're well-led, they're well-motivated. Isn't this what America is all about? How can we capture that spirit of family we saw over there and bring it back here to the United States so that that spirit can take hold and begin to infect all of our cities and towns around the country? So there was this huge outpouring of affection. It became so intense that at one point in July, I was getting calls from commanders all over the armed forces. Chairman, you got to do something. So what's the matter? Chairman, the parades won't stop. The troops, they're getting fat. All they want to do is go parade, eat, drink, and see young ladies or young boys, as the case may be. You've got to get the parades to stop. I said, no way. We haven't had this kind of a love affair going with the American people since 1945, and we're going to let them get their fill of it. Because once again, the armed forces of the United States and the American people had bonded together again. And we had to enjoy that. We had to build on it. And we did it in a way that also allowed those parades to be for the Vietnam veterans and even some of the Korean War veterans who didn't get their parades when they came home. The first one I went to was here in Chicago. I'll never forget that day. I'll never forget how the people of Chicago received us, especially received those Vietnam veterans who joined us that day. We are now in the process of bringing your armed forces down. We're cutting 40% of the Army, 40% of the Navy, 40% of the Air Force, 25% of the Marine Corps. We're cutting out hundreds of programs. We're closing hundreds of bases. It's proper for us to do this. In the absence of the Soviet Union, with the demise of the Warsaw Pact, with the failure of communism, we owe the American people a peace dividend, and we're paying it. But we are not going to do it the way we did it previous times in our history, by ripping apart the armed forces of the United States. They're going to stay strong. They're going to remain of high quality. They're going to be ready to go to the challenging areas that are all over the world and make sure that if they're ever called upon to fight, they will fight the way you saw in Desert Storm, proudly, well-led, well-trained, well-equipped, and always with the support of the American people. We need that kind of support from you forever. We must never go back to those days of estrangement that existed after Vietnam. My total passion for the last 4 years as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff wasn't for strategy, although that was important. It wasn't for a new weapon system, although that was important. And it wasn't just to reshape the size of the force and the structure of the force, although that was important. My total, overall, consuming passion was to make sure that we took care of those wonderful young men and women, not mercenaries, but your sons and daughters, volunteers all, willing to go and put their lives on the line for our security whenever and wherever we called upon them to go. You should be very, very proud of those young men and women. They have served you enormously well. And it has been my great privilege to have been one of them for 35 years and to have served as their representative for the past 4 years. I hope you are as proud of them as I have been. And I hope that in the course of the next few months, every time you see them at work in Somalia or Haiti or elsewhere on television, you'll think about them, say a prayer for their safety, because they're out there defending this great land that we all love so much and we're proud to call America. Thank you for allowing me to share these thoughts with you.
Thank you, General Powell, for a wonderful address. General Powell has agreed to stay around and take a few questions and give some very in-depth answers. And while he's doing that, I wish you would all take a moment to complete your pledge cards and give them to your table captains. And in the meantime, we're willing to take a few questions. Neil.
The question has to do with whether or not chemical weapons were used in the Gulf War. My professional and personal judgment is that no chemical weapons were used. In the course of the conflict and in the immediate period afterwards, when we were really looking at the battlefield, we found absolutely no evidence that chemical weapons were there, that they were used, and we did not even find Iraqi generals or leaders who we captured with any knowledge of how to use them. So I'm reasonably confident, there's always the possibility, but I'm reasonably confident chemical weapons were not used. The issue stems around some early warning chemical devices we had there that were Czechoslovakian monitoring systems mounted inside personnel carriers. And as I understand the reports, they gave alarms. I don't know if those were real alarms or false alarms. And so I do not believe, frankly, that chemical weapons were used. I cannot, however, account for the maladies and the illnesses that are being reported. I don't know if they were caused by other environmental circumstances or whether in some cases it might be psychosomatic, but I have seen no definitive information to suggest that chemical weapons exposure are the source of those injuries. You can't be sure. And what we're doing now, what they're doing in the Pentagon, is studying everything we have. The Veterans Administration and the military medical system are examining all of these youngsters because if we expose them to something like that and we were not aware of it and they're suffering from it, then we got to do something about it. So the military is not trying to cover it up. We just haven't found a basis yet for the claims that are being made and a source of the illnesses that are being reported. If it did turn out that such weapons were used, I think it would be a most serious matter how the president and the military leaders and other political leaders might respond to that with the government of Iraq. I wouldn't want to speculate about since it's no longer in my portfolio, shall we say. Germany? I'm sorry. What do I see happening in? The question is, what are my views about what's happening in Germany, particularly some of the skinheads we've seen running around, and some of the frightening events that have taken place as neo-Nazis have been a little more visible lately. I think it's an awful situation, but I'm not overly worried about it. I've lived in Germany, I've commanded units in Germany, I know all sides of the German political spectrum, and I am absolutely convinced that Germany and Germans and the German political structure is not fertile ground for this kind of thing, and that they, in their own very efficient way, will bring it under control, and the actions of these neo-Nazis does not represent anything like, we shouldn't think it represents anything approaching a general view, the general view of most Germans. Most Germans I know are as appalled by what they are seeing as we are. But it is a reminder that evil can still lurk. The worst kind of evil can still lurk in the hearts of man. We have to remain vigilant. And I think the German authorities are being vigilant. Yeah.
Now,
question is, with the downsizing of the military, will there be enough budget left for sufficient research and development for future weapon systems? There will be enough money left for that purpose, but we need to do a lot less research and development for future weapon systems, because with the end of the Soviet Union, we are not chasing new Soviet systems as aggressively as we were before. We were always trying to catch up with the latest Soviet airplane. We were always trying to make sure that our F-15 would be better than their MiG-29. We really did not know what was inside of their system. They're inside their systems, like tanks and planes. Now, if you want to know what's inside a MiG-29, the way to find out is there's a firm in Florida, I think it's in Tampa, that for $10,000 will get you a 45-minute ride in Moscow in a MiG-29. For $45,000, they will arrange for a 2-hour dogfight with 2 MiG-29s that you can participate in. I'm telling you, this is troubling me as an old infantryman. But you can pretty much find out what you want to know about Soviet systems by going on a tour, actually buying it. So the weapon systems we have now are the best in the world, and will stay that way for a longer period of time now that the Soviets are not trying to catch up or stay ahead of us. This is not to say that we don't invest in research and development. It is to say that as we stay at the leading edge of the state of the art, you may not always have to put all of those weapons into production, because there isn't a threat out there that you need these new advanced weapons for. Everybody has to remember, the nation wanted a peace dividend. We're paying that peace dividend, but it comes out of the size of the force coming down, cut back in production, closing of bases. Nobody wants to close a base in their hometown or their district, always somebody else's hometown and district. 700,000 troops fewer than when I became chairman 4.5 years ago. 700,000 jobs that are being given to the civilian economy to absorb, 700,000 fewer opportunities for young people to come into the military and get training, discipline, and structure. So I think there's enough money for research and development, but the glory days of the military-industrial complex are over. We are going through a permanent downsizing of our defense production base and our defense research and development base. We're trying to take a lot of that research and development capacity and convert it to civilian purposes, and I think that's great. My future plans? Today or a longer period of time? I heard politically, I heard 96. The question you're obviously asking is, do I have any plans to enter politics? At the moment, I do not have any plans to enter politics. I've been a soldier all my life. I'm now a civilian. I want to learn about a lot of other things that are happening in the country. I want to become familiar with issues that I didn't have a chance to become familiar with when I was on active duty. I want to take this new knowledge and new experience and see how I can make a contribution with that experience to serving my nation in some way. I don't know whether that would be in an appointed position or working with charitable organizations or doing something with community-based organizations. I'm not sure that politics would be the right thing for me. The one thing I can assure you is that I'm not going to disappear out into a dairy farm, and I'm leaving all of my options open to see what the future brings. Is that sufficiently vague? Yes, sir. The question's a good one. It's reported that Secretary Weinberger and me set the rules upon which you use U.S. force. Some years ago, about 10 years ago, Secretary of Defense Weinberger laid out certain rules that were really guidelines that he felt you had to follow or at least examine before you committed U.S. forces. I have used similar guidelines, although not identical to Mr. Weinberger, and they essentially go as follows. One, make sure you have a clear political objective you are trying to achieve. You never use military force merely to satisfy some military objective or because you're mad or because you're upset at what you saw on CNN that night. You have to have a clear political objective you are trying to achieve, and everybody understands it. It has to be a realistic objective. It has to be an objective that can be satisfied with the use of military force. If you have to use military force, and one should be reluctant to use military force, but if you have to use it, in my view, use it in a decisive way. Don't go in unless you're planning to do it right and you're planning to win, the way we did in Desert Storm. And the third thing you have to do, it seems to me, is have some understanding of how you're going to get out. What is your exit strategy? We had all of these in Operation Desert Storm. We knew what we were trying to do. It wasn't to go to Baghdad, and it wasn't to go get Saddam Hussein. It was to kick the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. We sent all the troops necessary to do that. We did it, and when we'd accomplished our mission, President Bush stopped the killing, and we brought our troops home, and that was the right decision. In Somalia, our initial objective was to go in and stop the starvation. That's what President Bush said we were going to do last Thanksgiving Eve. That's what we did, and we sent in 28,000 troops so that nobody would screw with us. 28,000 troops, I can assure you, were enough to deter any of the warlords who were there, and we got that mission accomplished. But then what? The United Nations had to be supported as they tried to build a nation so that the starvation wouldn't come back. Well, this is not quite as clear a mission. The mission got a little less clear. Nevertheless, we felt it was important to continue showing our support. And then violence broke out in Mogadishu, with first the Pakistanis being killed by Hadid forces, and then we tried to go after Hadid forces, and then, of course, we had the tragic loss of 18 Americans a month or so ago. I wish it was cleaner. It isn't cleaner. What the President has decided to do is say, look, we need to back off and take another look at our policy. And our policy is to support the United Nations. The United Nations, you have got to get other nations, third world nations, principally African nations, to be in the forefront of the military effort, to be patrolling these streets, to be giving a sense of security to those poor people in Somalia. We will provide logistic support, and we will provide enough force for the next 4 or 5 or 6 months in order for you to get that process underway. But we are not going to leave U.S. forces there for an indefinite period of time where they become the targets. U.S. forces are not like other forces in the world. When we go, we're the biggest guy on the block, and we are expected to bring magical results. And when those magical results don't occur, then we find ourselves in difficulty. And so we went in with a clear objective. We accomplished that mission. we have not been able to come up with as clear an objective in the UN phase of the operation. And regrettably, some youngsters lost their lives as a result of perhaps some of that lack of clarity. President Clinton has now clarified objectives: support the UN for 6 months with combat forces, then we're pulling out, and hopefully the UN will have put in place a force to deal with the situation, and there will have been a political reconciliation. The rules are still good. They may not always be entirely applicable, and a president may often have to make a decision that goes against these rules if there is a sufficient reason to ignore the rules. But the rules should really be seen as guidelines that you should at least take a look at before you commit U.S. forces. Every time we have not done that, we have gotten ourselves in some awful morass and regretted it later on, and we have paid for it with young American lives.
Gentleman right there.
Should we send American troops into Bosnia? If there is truly an agreement that all of the belligerents have signed up to, and you have a basis for thinking they honestly are going to implement those agreements, then I could support the use of U.S. forces to try to bring that agreement into effect. But if you don't think they are going to live up to those agreements and that the war is going to go on, then I would be most reluctant to put U.S. forces into the middle of that conflict that's been going on for 1,000 years, where 3 empires have come together over the last 1,000 years, and they are all intermixed. And when you have such deep-seated hatred of the various factions, you would have to send an extremely large force in there to put down that kind of violence. To send just a few troops in there, even 10 or 20,000, to try to referee such a situation, I think puts our troops in an impossible position. You either go in to settle something, or you help some people bring an agreement into effect. But go into the middle of a terrible ethnic conflict like that is the most difficult kind of military mission, and I don't think the American people would support it for any length of time. The question always came up during the past year and a half, well, why don't we bomb somebody? There's this simplistic American football mentality that says all you have to do is bomb somebody and everything will be fine. I'm afraid it isn't as simple as that. And so we were reluctant to use bombing as a very narrow tool that really wouldn't solve the problem, but would have the effect of bringing the United States into the conflict on the side of one of the belligerents. I had hope a month or two ago that the peace process was leading somewhere so we could get an agreement they would all, be willing to put into effect. But what they have decided is they'd rather continue fighting. And as long as they continue to believe that they can gain an advantage by fighting, then I don't think there's a role for U.S. or other Western forces.
2 more questions.
Yes, sir.
I appreciate your comments about Israel during the Gulf War. Unfortunately, I think that unless it's on CNN News every night, we tend to forget what's going on. A couple of weeks ago, there were allegations that Israel was selling nuclear war weaponry to China, and we as a community have to scrounge around and defend the allegations and do some research ourselves. I'd like you to comment a little bit about that. What your thoughts are.
Well, obviously, I think we should take seriously any reports of the transfer or proliferation of any pieces of equipment or technology or know-how having to do with weapons of mass destruction, among them being nuclear weapons. There have been such reports concerning Israel over the years, and whenever those reports came along, in the spirit of cooperation and as part of our strategic relationship, we would raise them with our Israeli colleagues. And for the most part, all of those concerns were satisfied. Very often it's disinformation and they're overblown. I am not privy to the latest dialogue since I'm out, but I have seen no evidence to suggest that nuclear components really had been transferred from Israel anyone. I think the Israeli government and the IDF understands the seriousness of any such thing and cannot believe they would participate in any such transfer.
Gentleman in the back of the room, last question.
I share Gloria Roosevelt paraphrase. Gloria shook the British Empire, took the British Empire when the hand was shaken in 1929. We had internecine war in Turkey. Pent-up emotion of hatred unleashed in Yugoslavia, which is private in nature. Russia, social movement, which is private in nature, also brought about conflict that is insurmountable. What is your prognosis, ability to prevent such internecine war on a racial footing that you tried to face in Mid-East?
Did you get the last part? Yeah. I guess, I'm not sure I got it all, sir. My prognosis on how these internecine conflicts ultimately will be resolved.
Will they? Do you think they will?
Speaking to the Middle East, I think it is unlikely in our lifetime that we will see the kind of reconciliation and rapprochement that we would hope for and dream of. We're truly living as brother and sister with those of different religious and ethnic backgrounds. But I do think there's hope that we can live in what let me choose to call it a protected peace, where we begin the process of reconciliation. I do think it is possible that you can create circumstances on the West Bank and Gaza and elsewhere where you can keep some separateness, but at the same time get along in a way that the neighboring nations find satisfactory, and they realize that the massive investment that is going into weaponry, the massive investment of human energy and material wealth into insurrection and rioting and terrorism is in no one's interest. I think we are reaching a period where people are becoming fatigued and exhausted in these conflicts of endless proportion. And they're willing to take some chances, they're willing to take some risks for a peace of sorts and for the promise of ultimate reconciliation. So I have no illusions. I know exactly what you're talking about in the United Kingdom, between Britain, Northern Ireland. We still have tragic situations that could boil over again. But in the Middle East, the wellspring of all of our cultures, the wellspring of the religions of the world, there is a unifying theme among the differences that says we are all of a God, one God. We all wish the best for our children. We all want peace. And if men and women of goodwill want peace, then let's try to achieve peace. We may never see a complete reconciliation, but we would not be Americans, we would not be faithful to our religious upbringing if we did not believe in that prospect and if we did not work for that prospect. So my own view is right now, this process that is underway, even though there will be violence in Gaza, even though there will be terrorist acts, even though the IDF may have to undertake operations from time to time, it is still moving us in the right direction, and we should not let this violence detract us from the prospect for peace.
General Powell, on behalf of the Jewish United Fund, Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago, as proud Americans and as proud Jews, we thank you for today And we thank you for the last 35 years. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.